Hey y'all, it's me, CheesyPaninie. A couple of days ago, a fan messaged me on the forums asking about how to make it easier to build without mods or editors since he plays on mobile, and that got me thinking about making a video for it. And I understand that for PC gamers who will soon get the 1.4 update with the Journey mode that has most of the features I use for building with mods, not every tip might be applicable. Mobile and console players may benefit a lot more from this video, but I still urge PC players to watch it because some tips can still be useful for building in general. So today I'm going to give you a couple of tips and tricks that I picked up over the years. I actually didn't even use mods for my first builds and I survived quite well without them. And if I can do it, so can you. With mods, the items you have may be in bigger stacks or infinite amounts. Without mods, your materials will be limited and mistakes are a lot more costly to make, especially when it comes to paint. Paint can only really be acquired through the painter NPC, so you will need a whole lot of money just to gain a couple of paint buckets. So say you make a house and decided to use green paint and later realize it probably looks better with blue, but no, you should probably keep it green because you spent so much money on it, and then you change it to blue anyway because you really like blue, but then you realize, yeah, I should have kept it green. And what about leaf blocks? You place one with a leaf wand and a block of wood, but if you change your mind, you can't get your materials back. When you mine it, it just disappears. So because of those limitations, it's very important to minimize waste by planning your build. This is super important because if you have a clear idea about what you want to make, it will save you a whole lot of time. There are 3 ways to go about this. The first one is to draw. Now, you don't have to be an expert on drawing to do this. It can really just be boxes, circles, squiggles, or whatever. The main purpose of this is to have an idea of where objects in your build will be positioned and how big they are. If you want to get super specific about the spacing or number of blocks to put and other details, I suggest drawing this on a dotted or grid paper for planning. Kevin McLeod actually has a dotted and grid paper generator, which I use to make one for my own. And yes, it's the guy who mostly dominates the YouTube audio library and owns Incompetech.com. If you're interested, I've left a link down in the description. For the second way, you can go look for reference pictures based on real life, in-game builds, or other works of art, and just make your own rendition of it. References can be really helpful guides for determining the shape and details of your build. I use these a lot when trying to make my own spin on things like my Bob Ross build or Pokemon Pallet Town build. Now, if neither of those ways interest you, you could always go for the third way, which is to write it down. Basically, you make a list or write down a description of what you want to make in your world. You can write down details of the build so you could figure out what and how many materials you need, and for you to not forget anything. But of course, despite all the planning you will be doing, I want to remind you guys that not everything you planned will end up in your build, so don't get too frustrated. Treat your plan as a guide. Since you now know the different ways you can plan your build, let me give you some tips that can help you in your planning phase. Tip number 1, scan your map. It is essential that you know the surrounding area in your map before building. I mean, it would be kind of unfortunate if, say, you build an Egyptian city and you're really into it only to realize that the desert biome on this side of the map was just a really small speck, and you could have built it on the other side of the map, which had a larger desert. You can either do it manually by walking or flying around the area to reveal it, or if you're not too opposed to it, you can use a map viewer to reveal the whole map in a flash. There is a link in the description for map viewers that you can use. Tip number 2. Use pallets. This is especially important when you're making builds with paint or just have trouble deciding on what items to use. There are a lot of people in the Terraria community who makes different types of pallets which can aid in building. I've also made my own block palette on my website and I have the link in the description. As of this video, it's still not complete, but I plan to update it once 1.4 drops and mods and T-edit update. Aside from this, you can also check out the Terraria wikis to learn more about certain materials. Tip number 3. Build in order. I don't always follow this, but sometimes it's really practical to keep it in mind. The best build order that I've encountered so far is blocks and platforms, then furniture and walls, then mechanisms last. Let me explain why. The reason why you'd want to build with blocks and platforms first is so that you can form the foundation. Furniture certainly can't be placed without them after all. For the next, you can actually do walls or furniture first depending on you and your build. The reason why you'd want to do walls after blocks is because you'll be doing a lot of hammering, and if you had a wall behind it, there's a tendency to remove walls as you hammer. You could use weaker hammers to prevent walls from getting destroyed, but sometimes you can't avoid it, so it's best to do walls later on. The last thing you want to place would be mechanisms. This part actually depends on what your goal is for your build, but if it's just for simple things like wiring blocks that can be actuated or wiring 2 teleporters together, this is something you would want to do later after your whole build is done. Tip number 4. Experiment with materials and save them for later. Sometimes I would like to try combining different materials to form patterns or props in my build and try them out first before committing to the full build. If you have designs you made that you really like, I suggest taking screenshots of those details for future reference. You might find yourself reusing those details in the future. Tip number 5. For repeating patterns, finalize the first part before doing the rest. Imagine making a long road with custom-made light posts, and once you made like 20 light posts, you realized that you wanted to add in an extra detail. You would have to edit every single one of them. So to avoid that kind of nightmare, make sure that the first part of that pattern is as good as you can make it. Check for mistakes and just stick with that pattern. If you think of something better, you can always save that for the next build instead. The next disadvantage you could face when building without mods is gathering materials. There are 2 ways you can go about this. You can gather your own materials, or you can download and use maps uploaded by other Terraria players that contains all the items in the game. Yep, that's right. There are some really awesome people in the community who went out of their way to collect all the items and organize them for other players to use. There's a map called Builder's Workshop made by Tel in the CurseForge website, and it's been super helpful to me when I was building my first builds. I'll leave a link where you can download the map in the description, along with links to videos that can teach you how to install it on PC, Mac, and mobile for Android and iOS. However, it's currently not possible to install it on console. And before I forget, for mobile players who are still in the 1.3 update, you'd want to download the 3.2 version of Builder's Workshop. Now, in case you can't or don't feel like using this map and want to gather the materials on your own, I have a couple of tips. Tip number 1, store your stuff in a new world. First, make a new world that you won't be adventuring in. This world will act as your warehouse of sorts, where you'll be putting chests filled with your building items. It's always a good idea to have something like this even if you're not building, and you can use it as a backup for good measure in case you run out of items, an item gets lost, or the map gets corrupted. Tip number 2. Explosives can be your best friend or worst enemy. Explosives are extremely useful for harvesting large clumps of items and materials. However, not all items can be destroyed with them, and some blocks still require special pickaxes to be used to harvest them. Aside from this, you can actually use explosives to help you make circles. They don't really explode into perfect circles, so you need to adjust it a little, but they do help a ton in creating the shape. Just be careful because you don't want to accidentally break your build with those. Tip number 3. Don't forget about smart cursors. The smart cursor mode is used to automatically select and use the item you are holding on the closest object to your cursor when you click and hold. You can use this mode for placing blocks, walls, platforms, minecart tracks, wires, acorns, and you can also use it to dig blocks, chop trees, and hammer walls. It helps a lot in digging long distances for gathering and placing items quickly. Depending on what platform you're playing on, there are different buttons that can activate the smart cursor mode. Tip number 4. Liquid duplication. Duplication? Are you gonna teach us how to hack? No. I'm just gonna teach you how to take advantage of a certain feature with liquids. You see, when a liquid is settled or contained, it takes up a few tiles, but when it flows, their volume tends to increase. So if the liquid flows down and hits a block, it doubles the amount of water. If you want to duplicate liquids fast, you can make this block pyramid with gaps and just pour the liquid, then take some mid-air with your empty bucket, then pour it again. Repeat until you have enough water, lava, or honey. There are actually some people who developed a way to farm liquids with a wiring system to make it all easier. Unfortunately, I'm not very good at wiring yet, so if you guys are interested to learn how to make liquid farms, you can check out the link to a guide down in the description. Another thing non-modders encounter when building is the unavoidable attack of the spawns. Slime rain here, blood moon there, Eye of Cthulhu everywhere. So what do? Well, you know fam, you can't really do anything about random events, but there are things you can do to protect yourself against spawns. Tip number 1. Make NPC houses. That's right, you heard me, make NPC houses. It doesn't have to be fancy, you can just make one of those really small boxes temporarily. The important thing is for them to spawn where you're building because the number of NPCs in an area can affect monster spawn rate. If you get at least 3, that's minus 40% spawns when above the underworld and minus 17% when in the underworld. Tip number 2. Use spawn reducing items. There are 3 items that I know of at this moment that reduces spawn rates. First off, the peace candle. This one is actually a little bit difficult to craft since pink gel can be a little tough to come by. However, if you have this, it can reduce the effective spawn rate by 23% and the max spawn by 30% within a 48 tile radius. The next item is the sunflower. When you plant them in the area, you can have a 17% reduction in enemy spawn rate and a negative 20% in max spawns within a 50 tile radius. It can even give you plus 10% movement speed. One thing to note though is that sunflowers can only be placed on grass. The third item is the calming potion. This potion lasts for 5 minutes and can reduce effective spawn rate by 23% and max spawns by 30%. If you use all of these items together, they will reduce spawn rates by a whopping 51%. However, I'm not sure if they stack with the NPC reduced spawn rate effects. Tip number 3. Blocking enemies with blocks. Now, this only really works in a small space. And by a small space, I meant as far as your camera can see. Because the moment your wall of blocks go beyond the map, an enemy can kind of spawn in. It's not the best form of defense, but sometimes it's all you need when you're just building in a small space. Of course, it's a whole different story if you're underground because those really annoying worms don't care what blocks you place. Tip number 4. Get armed. When there's just no avoiding spawns, you have to be prepared to defend yourself. But this doesn't necessarily mean you have to stop building. This just means that you have to get yourself a good item that can summon minions that can fight for you, or get a good armor that can keep you alive. One of the armors that I liked for building was chlorophyte armor, because if you wore the whole set, you'll have this floating leaf above your head that will attack any enemy that comes close. Now for the last problem we're gonna tackle, light. Modders have the advantage of using light hacks to keep all of the blocks illuminated, and the advantage of changing the time of day and weather with a push of a button. Non-modders do not, and I have several tips to get around this disadvantage. Tip number 1. Use light-producing items. This goes without saying, and while there are a lot of items you can use for this, there are 4 items that I think makes a huge difference when building in the dark or during the night. There are a couple of armor sets you can choose from, but one of the most useful ones for building is the mining helmet. It not only provides light, but it also gives you a 30% mining speed if you complete the whole set, which will aid you greatly in digging and gathering blocks. For potions, I highly recommend getting yourself a shine potion, which emits an aura of light for up to 5 minutes. However, if you don't like having to craft and use a shine potion every time, you can just summon a light pet instead. There are several different light pets, but the one I like the most is the Wisp, because it gives off 120% brightness and can be controlled with movement keys. For the final item, we have white torches. White torches may be a little bit expensive to craft since you need to find diamonds, which can be pretty rare. However, they are the brightest light in the game at the time of this recording and can produce 50% more light than a regular torch. And because it produces white light, it won't affect the colors of the blocks you are working with. Tip number 2, build during the day, gather during the night. If you really have a hard time building during the night, then I suggest only building during the day and using up the nighttime to do other things such as dig, gather materials, and fight off monsters. Alternatively, you can also build underground during the night and above ground during the day. One thing I'd like you all to remember is that every one of us has our own ways of building, and there really is no best way to do a particular thing. One tip or technique may work for one person and not work for another. It really differs from person to person, and the only real way for you to get better, just like everything else, is to practice. If you want to get more tips on what tools, armor, and accessories you can use for building, I also have 2 other videos dedicated to that subject that you can check out. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, please leave a like. If you want build tips on a specific subject or theme, let me know down in the comments below and I may just do it. Share to people who you think this video might help, and subscribe if you haven't yet. And before this video ends, I would love to thank my patrons, Patrick Crowhurst, Sean Jizyanowski, and Kyle. I'm deeply grateful and hope you know how motivating it is for a small channel like me to gain this kind of support. Thank you so much. So for now, I'm just gonna go do my thing, and you guys do your thing, and I'll see you guys later. Take it easy. Stay cheesy.